All right, well, if you went upstairs to the four-story theater for today, you did the right thing. That's where we were supposed to be today. But there were some things that came up on the calendar that we didn't know were on the calendar. And then also the lights up there as well have not been working very well this week. So anyway, I was asked on Friday, or I was told that it would be better for us to come downstairs. So we're down here today, so I appreciate your finding your way down here. Also, when I invited Matthew Groves to come and speak this summer, we talked about his schedule, and I said I would really love for you to be able to come and do a whole summer series, and he was excited to do that. But he said, well, I will have to go out of town at some point this summer. And so he did take that 1 week off in the middle of the series. And then he said this week as well, he would need to travel. And I thought it very unfair to bring in a guest speaker on the tail end of a series when also I know that this is like the last big vacation time for a lot of people. So usually by this time, our summer series numbers have gone down a bit. So rather than have a guest speaker come in today, I told Matthew that I would fill in this last space. And I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction than he's been going, but I'm kind of going in full circle. Because we've sort of been, the last month, you've been in a lot of the creation care mindset. We've been talking a lot about earth, a lot about the environment, a lot about things that we can both be aware of around the environment and things we can do to better take care of our world. But the first month, when Matthew was talking a lot about the intersections of science and faith, especially when he delved into different aspects of the book of Genesis and other things, where he tried to help us think about how science helps us look at and wonder about the world in one way, is what he talked about. And then he said that religion helps us think about and wonder about the world in another way. And so science has a particular method and a way of viewing and seeing the world that has very powerful and practical implications in many ways, but that religion has always served as another imagination or another way of thinking about the world and of experiencing the world. And that we talked about with Matthew when he was here that first couple weeks. He talked about that in religion we often we receive our knowledge of the world through revelation or through spiritual discovery, those types of things. And that's quite a bit different from science sometimes. But the two interplay more and more all the time in our lives as science helps us understand more about the world. So to wrap up everything we've been talking about this summer, I thought it would be really good and important for us to look at a few things that I think are key theological issues. And theological sounds like a big fancy word, but whenever I teach a class and I say something about theology, I say just remember that theology is just basically words about God. So what are the things about the world as it is today and as we understand it today, and also in the ways that technology is rapidly changing the ways that we live? How does our faith as Christians both speak into the world we live in today? How does that world speak back into our faith? And what are the real challenges and real growing edges for all of us who claim to be part of the Christian faith and want to figure out how to live out our faith in this world that is largely being shaped now by a scientific and a technological imagination? So I want to address the future a bit. Now I want to say something, and anytime I mention the future, it's important to say the future's murky. Nobody can tell you what the future is going to be like. People often guess about what the future will be like, but we never know for sure. But what we can see is we can always kind of dream about the future, think about what might be coming, and look for what the possibilities are and also what some of the liabilities might be. Some of the things that we might have to really wrestle with as the world changes as the future moves toward us. And I think that our moment carries a really unique set of theological challenges. I think that a lot of people that are looking at the world today, both in the realms of science and technology, but then also in a lot of other realms, and then also in religion as well, are saying, you know what, with the changes that we have had in technology and the ways that the world is connected in newer ways than it's ever been before, that this could be a real watershed moment for humanity, much like the printing press was about 500 years ago, around the same time that what happened in the church, or the Protestant church that we inherited. What happened around that time? The Reformation, right. So the Protestant Reformation, it's no coincidence that that breaks out and is enabled around the same time that there's this new powerful technology called the printing press. And in fact, the Word took precedence in a new way, and the Scripture took precedence in a different way amongst Protestant Christians. And we are inheritors of that history, of that 500-year history. Well, now many people would say that we are facing a time, because of where we are and where science and technology is actually bringing us, that we may be at a new real hinge time. And so all the ways that we are living are being challenged, but then also even the ways that we think about being Christians might be challenged in the coming years. But you know, the funny thing is that these challenges are not necessarily new things. They just take on a new tenor in the environment that we live in today. So all of what I'm going to do today is I'm going to invite you around your tables for a couple of, maybe for like 3 or 4 minutes. I'm going to throw out a theological idea that I would argue is one of the most important things we're struggling with right now in the age in which we live. And then I'm going to help you look at a few of the things. Now this is we're just going to skip the surface today of some things. But I'm going to show you 5 things that I think are key theological components to our faith that we're going to have to really dig deep and start to reimagine who we are as Christians in the midst of the age in which we live. And so I'm going to invite a little bit of table discussion about each of these. And then I'm going to tell you a few of the things that I have been interested in, the ways that these things are being challenged and reshaped. And then I'm going to highlight a little key piece of theological tradition that I think we may need to reclaim and may need to play with a lot more as we try to figure out how to be Christians in this world we live in today. So, the first one we're going to tackle, and we're going to do 5. The first one that I think is a big one today, and is, like I said, rooted in theology from forever. So, the Christian faith, the Jewish faith that came before the Christian faith, has wrestled with what is it to be human? What is human identity? But I want you to do this. I want you around your tables for like 3 or 4 minutes. I want you to try to talk about what is it that makes a human a human. So what is a human? What makes humanity unique in your mind? Okay? So spend a couple minutes talking about what is a human, or what defines humanity. Go for it. Okay, so let me hear some of your answers. What were some of the things that you said, if we had to say, what is a human, what are some of the things that you thought were key things to mention?
Go for it.
You got something, Gene?
Oh, we all do.
Okay, what do you have?
Reasoning.
Reasoning, okay.
A relationship.
Okay, so we've got 2 there. We got one, an ability to reason in a certain way, to think through things, to comprehend the world in a reasonable fashion, maybe. And then also relationships, right? What it is to be in relationship with each other. Okay, you were thinking with each other, okay? And with God. What's back there? Right, deep sense of symmetry. Sometimes we talk about that as aesthetics, right? Like different.
I say aesthetics are a higher judgment.
You think aesthetics are a higher judgment?
That's as a result of symmetry.
You think that's as a result of symmetry. Okay. And then you mentioned history and story and kind of continuity. That's a really interesting thing to say because a lot of the social sciences and research that's being done today on what a person is, there's a real interest again in the storytelling abilities of humanity. And in fact, a sense that maybe part of who we are is the story that we tell ourselves. And it's no coincidence that we, as people of faith and other faith traditions, have gathered around stories throughout the ages. So I think stories do tell us something about being human. What else? Anything else that some other table said that hasn't been mentioned yet? You feel like you need to say? Yeah. Sense of our own mortality. Yes, a sense of our own mortality, understanding that our lives are finite in some way. Mm-hmm. What else, Nancy? What's that? Faith. Okay. So an ability to have faith. That's something that we may think is unique to humans. Yes. Anything else that you need to say? Yeah.
The fact that we're created in the image of God.
Okay.
That makes us unique among God's creation.
Okay. So being created in the image of God. And you're jumping ahead of me a little bit there, James, because one of the things that I'm going to suggest is a key theological tenet that we have to reclaim and wrestle with very, very heavily right now in our age is what does it mean when we say we are created in the image of God? And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I want to, again, like I said, I'm going to skip through a bunch of things, and I'm mostly wanting to wake up your imagination and get you to go and start Googling and reading and finding some books and things like that to really start thinking about some of these things. Because you know these things are happening, you're just not always thinking about it probably. These are some of the things that I think are some key challenges to our thinking about being human today. One thing is the rise of robotics and artificial intelligence. What does it mean to be looking at an age where we are more and more surrounded by both robots and artificial intelligence? Now you might say, well, that sounds way, way futuristic, but I was talking to somebody up in the office the other day, and they were saying how they were at Walmart, and some people were shopping, and all of a sudden this robot came by, and it was scanning all the items. It was doing inventory, which a person would have done at one time, and it was taking, and they kind of made room for the robot, and it went on its way, and it was scanning the inventory there. Artificial intelligence now, Amazon's playing with all sorts of artificial intelligence. Who has an Alexa in their home? Does anybody have an Alexa? I do. So I can say, Alexa, play me this, and it'll play something. Although sometimes it gets it wrong. But I've got this little artificial intelligence hub living in my house now. How many people in here have a smartphone? Okay. So now I hit the mother lode there. Almost everybody has a smartphone, right? This changes the way that we think about who we are and how we even do things. If you think about it, 10 years ago, if you'd been having a conversation and somebody said, oh, I can't remember that person's name, or what was that movie, or whatever, and you'd actually have a dialogue trying to figure it out. Now you just Google it in 2 seconds flat and the conversation's over. You're on to something else, So not only are we having to start to think, what does it mean to live in a world where we might be surrounded by robotics in a sense that's separated from us, but then also what is it to be in an augmented world, in a world where we are actually more functional because we have devices. Our medical advancements are even getting more ahead of the curve in some ways. For instance, in the last 15 years, we've seen the real implementation of things like bionic limbs, that kind of stuff. We know that nanotechnology is coming into usage and is starting to be looked at for ways to repair the human body in and of itself. We know that there are ways now to think about how to intervene on embryos and fetuses in utero or even before in utero to try to work on certain diseases. We know about gene therapies. So there are all of these things that are either enhancing or changing what it might mean to be human. Put all that into conversation when a Christian comes up to you and says, we are created in the imago Dei. We are created in the image of God. I think that there is something very powerful and important about the conversation for people of faith, but also for the world, about what it means to say, who are we as beings created in the image of God? The world is begging us to have these conversations. And it's going to be complicated. It's going to be an interesting time in the future to think about what it is to actually be a human. And technology is bringing part of that. So I want to launch off from that, though, to another key thing that I want you to talk about for a minute. So we talk about being created in the image of God, right? That we have this beautiful image, this faithful image of that there is something uniquely precious about the way that we are created. And then we get these ideas about what's our body and our soul and our spirit. We throw these words around a lot, especially soul and spirit in faith communities. And I think this is really important to think about today because some of the Christian communities that are growing the fastest and are on fire across the globe are ones that are actually rooted in a notion of the Spirit being alive and moving. That may make us uncomfortable sometimes, especially us nice and upright United Methodists that like to sit in our pews. But the idea of is there spirit? Is there anything outside of ourselves that we relate to, or is everything internal? Is everything a product of what we understand ourselves to be in terms of our materiality, in terms of our physical person? So I want you to do this. I want you to spend a couple minutes, because this is the second of the 5 things that I think are going to be important to think about in the future. I want you to talk for a minute about what you think is the soul. Go for it. What is the soul? So I know, I gave you a long time to answer what the soul is, right? That's really good. What are some things, though, that were mentioned at your table that you said, if I had to describe, if I even believe, I'm making you talk about something that I can't even say that you all agree on or believe exists. The soul is actually something that has been talked about in various forms of religion for a long time, and now you can find, especially a lot of psychologists and other people that work in the realm of mental health, trying to define, is there anything scientific to even say about what a soul is? But soul, what did you say? What did you say? If you had to say, what's a soul?
Jerry's your turn.
All right, go for it. You can do it.
She's the speaker.
No. Go for it, Jerry.
She wants you to do it this time.
Spiritual gift from God.
Okay. So a spiritual gift from God. So something that we receive from God.
At birth.
Okay, at birth. So that would be, if we think of the soul in that way, then that would be something that is an essence that's imparted to the body that's separate from the body, right? That would be something that might be. That is often how many Christians, especially in our culture and in the Protestant church, has thought about the soul for some times now. I'm going to, in a little bit, I'm going to push back on that a bit and say that might be something we need to think about some more as we revisit our roots and heritage, especially in Judaism. Anything else? Anything else you said about the soul? Yeah.
According to Google,
Oh, I love it. According to Google. There you go. What's the soul according to Google?
John Wesley would open up all small group meetings with the question,
That's right. When somebody actually has the nerve to tell us how they're doing. You know, that's great. I'm glad you drew us back to our Wesleyan roots, because that's exactly right. Anyone in here that's in a covenant discipleship group knows that one of John Wesley's core tenets for his class meetings was simply to ask people, how is it with your soul? How is it with your soul? Meaning, tell me about the depth of whatever it is that's going on in there. And where do you need help? Where do you need God's guidance? Where do you need the guidance of those of us that are going to hold you accountable? So I love that you drew us back to that Wesleyan notion of how is it with your soul. And that's almost a caretaking thing too. What is it to care about other people's souls, however we think about that? Anything else? Anybody else need to get in a real big thing about souls? Here's some things that I think are going to be key challenges as science and technology continue to help us understand more about the physical world around us. The first is, if we want to think about soul, or how is it with your soul, or what is it that God gifts us uniquely as people created in the Imago Dei, we're going to have to continue to wrestle with the relationship between the body and the mind. We've always known, and intuitively, religions have often known that the mind and body are very much connected, that mental health even, and physical posture and all of these things can be somehow connected to one another. And our sciences are actually telling us, yes, we actually need to pay more attention to the body. We're actually getting to a phase now where the height of the rational age, want to be good rational people, right, that are thinking the height of the rational age would have said, we think, therefore we are, right? Well, now we know that sometimes our bodies affect our brains and vice versa. So what does that mean about who we are? We're going to have to think and dream and pray more carefully about what it means for our bodies and our minds, and whatever it is that we see to be our souls are connected. There's also this quest for tranquility, I think, in our society. Up to 33% of individuals right now in their lifetime will actually be treated for anxiety, for some type of anxiety. Some people say that anxiety is the prevalent disease of the modern age for some reason. And people are trying to figure out why that is and studying what is it that's making us feel anxious and more isolated. Or is this something that's not new, but we're just aware of it in a different way, or we're calling it something. Nobody knows why for sure, but anxiety is being treated more and more. And so the National Center for Biotechnology Information tells us 33% of people in our society will be treated for anxiety sometimes during their life. And this begs an interesting question. If we think that we are people created in the image of God in a certain way, and we think of ourselves as being ensouled in some way, what does it mean that I can go to a doctor and they can give me a pill and it can literally change who I am? If you've ever talked to somebody that has struggles with mental health, sometimes the hardest thing for them to do is take their medication regularly, because they say it makes me feel so different. Even though it might make them function better, at least in the way the world wants or something else, or maybe in a way that they want. But at the same time, they feel different, And so what does it mean that we are starting to understand our bodily chemicals and functions well enough that we can actually sort of change who we are? Do we have an essence? We've kind of lived on this idea that the soul is somewhat separate from the body. Science and technology are going to challenge us on that in the future. And so we have to think about, how do we articulate what it is that we think it means to be created in the image of God? And then are we simply a collection of mechanics and of algorithms. We're living in an age now where people are starting to try to, and every age tries to decipher humanity in the paradigm with which it thinks, right? So whatever is the reigning thing that's capturing people's attention, they start to think in that way. Well, right now, certain scientists, certain futurists are starting to say, well, humans are really just a set of algorithms. And if we can figure out those algorithms, we can kind of figure out humanity. Who gets targeted ads on the internet that tries to sell them exactly what they wanted? Yeah, we've already got companies analyzing us as algorithms, trying to get at the essence of who we are if they can get enough data points and figure out what the things are that make us move are, that we are actually just algorithms. So are we just mechanics and algorithms, or is there some deep essence? Is there something else in there? And this is where I think yes, what do you want to say real quick?
Back in the
Oh.
1800s, just early psychologists believed that we're just, receptacles to be influenced by different stimuli. So that goes all the way back to the beginning of psychology.
Well, like I said, everything new is old. And we're still playing with the same things and the same, trying to figure ourselves out like we always have. Yes?
I just had a question.
Uh-huh.
You have the quest for tranquility.
Uh-huh.
Where do you put happiness on that spectrum? Because it seems like those are the two things. So you see magazines at the store that are mindfulness, the whole magazine. is
Right.
mindfulness. But then you also see we need to reach for happiness. So where is that on the spectrum?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. We'd have to play with that for a while. I think some of that depends on what people define as tranquil or happy. Some people would say that that this kind of idea of being anxiety-free would be happiness. And then others would say happiness is something different from tranquility or peace of mind, so to speak.
I think about the Bible that talks about don't be anxious.
Uh-huh.
And it talks about joy.
Right.
But I don't recall a lot of things saying you need to be happy. You need to do what makes you happy.
Okay, that's a good question. So is there a difference between being happy? And we're going to talk in just a minute. I'm going to get to another key thing that I think is going to be really important for us to think about in the future as people of faith, on the fourth tenet of faith here. That'll get to that a little bit when we talk about what does it mean to have a Christian vocation. Does that mean being happy? Does it even mean always being tranquil? I don't know. But I do think that is where we're trying to get right now. Like you said, you see that a lot of places. And you see it both in the realm of spirituality and in medicine, right? People are trying to find ways to be mindful, to step out of the frenetic pace of whatever it is that's going on in life right now, that's being exacerbated by our technology as well. But when we think about our connection to soul and what it means to be spiritual beings, we need to be willing to go back and really listen to what our earliest texts say about the connection of the body and the spirit. Early Judaism, with the idea of the nefesh and the ruach, you all did ruach and renewal here one time, right? The Spirit of God at work in us. Most of the time, in the foundational ideas that led up to Christianity, most of the time, the idea that the spirit could be completely separated from the body was not a Judeo-Christian idea. It was actually Platonism, in other ways of thinking, in Greek thought, that kind of have bled into our own ways of thinking about the soul. But I'm not saying you have to think like me or have to change your whole view of the soul. I'm simply saying that we need to go back and be willing to really revisit these ideas that we worship a God that we say came and took on flesh, right? And that we are all incarnated people too. And that I think this idea that we are physical beings is a really important thing, and it's becoming more and more important in our world today. And spirituality is going to have to address that. Christian faith is going to have to take seriously the body, not just a soul that is taken apart from the body. Now, here's a big one. The promises of our Christian faith. I want you to take a couple minutes and tell me what you think some of the key hopes or promises of Christianity are. What is it that makes people come to a Christian church, or what have people been promised as they come to the Christian faith? Go into that for a minute. All right. I don't want us to run out of time, so I'm going to cut you off. Surely you came up with a few things, though. Y'all been Christians a long time, right? What are some of those things you came up with? Yeah, W.O. Okay, so maybe sometimes churches have been a way of controlling people. So that could be a negative view of religion and church. Okay, so that could be one kind of promise. And actually, I would say that that is a promise that the New Testament has held out since the days of Paul, to getting beyond a place where there are, male, female, Gentile, Jew, slave free. There's a vision of that you talk about that has been promised in different ways by the church throughout history. And the church has lived into that sometimes in good ways, and sometimes has fallen woefully short of that promise. What are some of the other promises or things? Yes? So a way to step outside of myself, a way to step outside of yourself, and know that there is something bigger, something greater than yourself. Okay, what else?
Eternal life.
Eternal life, that's right. How can you possibly talk about Christianity without talking about the claim of eternal life, and what that has meant for people throughout the ages, right? Eternal life is a key promise in Christianity. It just is. Anything else? Yeah, Amy. Okay, so forgiveness. So forgiveness on top of that unconditional grace and love, that promise of forgiveness. Good. Those are all great things. So I want you to think about some of these things then that I think are challenges coming out right now to us around these things. And who was it that said something? Oh, it was you talking about controlling, right, W.O.? I think that's perfect, because this is where I want to challenge us a bit to reimagine who God might be and how God might be understood even as we go back and revisit our scriptures again. One thing that is a key challenge is that researchers are finding that humans are really terrible at understanding how random the world is. We like to superimpose order on things that have no order. I'm not going to get into all of that right now because I don't have time to. But if you'd like to do some reading on that, there's a great book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by, is his name Daniel Kahneman? I think it's Daniel. But anyway, Kahneman is his last name. It starts with a K. And he's actually an economist and a social theorist. But he looked at mathematically at the ways that people deal with the true nature of chance and randomness. And so there are people out there that are telling us today that there are a lot of things in the world that are just absolutely random, that are just absolutely by chance, and that we want to take chance and superimpose order on top of that. Now, you may agree or disagree with that, but what I'm telling you is that the idea of randomness and of not having control, W-O, is a key thing that a lot of people are exploring today, and is going to be a real challenge to faith, especially a faith that says there is top-down control, right? If we say that there's a faith that has top-down control. Another thing, we talk about thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Well, what does it mean for thy kingdom to come in a world that is increasingly dependent on technology for livelihood? What is daily bread? What is daily bread if it requires tech? What is access to daily bread if, what is the kingdom to come as we shape this new world? How do we take care of, how do we have the mercy and the unconditional love for persons in this new world? And then also, you mentioned immortal life or eternal life. Scientists still today are trying, and futurists especially, are still trying to figure out a way to make us immortal. Now, many people will say that's a fool's errand and it's never going to happen. But there are people, and thinking through the technological mindset, that say, well, maybe if we're all algorithms and we're all really whatever our body's processing in our brains and telling our brains, maybe there's a way to download myself and put myself out there in the world in the future. Now, that sounds really crazy, but that's the way people are thinking today. And even if some of the more measured futurists and some of the more measured scientists are saying, we don't know that we're anywhere close to that kind of eternity, that kind of immortality. But what does it mean for life to even take on longevity? What happens if we can get to a point where people live 120 years instead of, 60, 70, 80 years? In some ways, that sounds great, right? Think about this, though. Think about some of the key figures in World War II. If the key figures in World War II could have lived 120 years, Stalin would have died in 1998, Hitler would have died in 2009, and Roosevelt would have died in 2002. So you can see that the longer people live, there are more generations of certain ways of living and imagination going on at the same time. So we have to learn new ways of thinking about the world together as we live longer. These are all things that are going to challenge what it is to be people that try to follow God. And I would say this is about God's providence, how it is that God works in the world. One of my favorite current theologians, who is a Wesleyan, he's actually Nazarene, his name is Thomas J. Oord, O-O-R-D. And I'm going to teach a book this fall called God Can't that he wrote. And he wants to suggest that we've tried to make God too controlling, and that maybe we need to think about the ways that God does not control, but rather reaches out and invites us into relationship with God to come alongside the ways that God would have the world be and would work. And so there are theologians starting to say, how do we take a world that we think is more random than we ever thought, that we think is more confusing than we ever thought, with people that are living longer than they ever have, and how do we make sense of that as people that want to follow a God that we believe is at work in the world in some way? How is that God at work in our world? Those are going to be big challenges to being people that live into God's providence. Fourth thing that's going to be really challenged in the age that we live in, our sense of vocation. What is it that makes us have a vocation? Vocation is not always been thought about in the same way. But I want you to do this real quick. Turn to your table for like a minute or two. If you're retired, that's fine. Still think about how you would either answer this question or maybe how you have answered this question in the past. What happens when somebody says, "What do you do?" Go, talk at your tables for a minute. What do you do? How do you answer that question? So when someone asks, "What do you do?" where do you gravitate? What do you say? What do you do? Tell me what you say. Okay, so you gravitate to your job. Who else gravitates to their job? What if you don't have a job? Where do you go? What's that?
Family.
So you say something about family. Okay, what else? Yeah?
I think that's part of challenging.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so he said he went through a difficult time in his school system a few years ago. So you're a teacher, right? Yeah, so he said that was actually, it kind of shook him to the core of his identity because he's so identified with being that.
Especially in that.
With being a teacher in that district. So what is it when what we do identifies who we are? And then we navigate that. What are the things that we do? And is what we do the same thing as who we are? Now, we would like to say no, right? We would like to say no, but we also know that often when we talk in regular conversation, we make a lot about who we are, about what we do. and vice versa. Now, that's not the same in all cultures, and that's not the same everywhere, but in our culture, that's certainly the case. And I would argue that there's a heavy dose of Protestant work ethic that helped create part of that, part of our Protestant heritage, the notion of vocation that actually Luther had. And I'm going to mention that in a minute. But I want to show you a few of the challenges because we're running low on time. So I want to show you what I think are some key things that are challenging us around this today. First of all, we've got to figure out how to have identity beyond our utility. Because in the future, one of the things that some people are looking at is there going to be a day where we have a non-labor economy? Or even if it's a non-labor economy, are we going to be in an age where we have a very low labor economy? If even though we're not, even maybe we may not agree that we are algorithms, but if algorithms in computers and in robots and machines and things like this can start to do a lot of the things that we used to do, that means that there may be fewer opportunities to do some of those things that used to provide income. In fact, in Finland a year or two ago, and I have a relative in Finland, so I was visiting the year they were doing this, Finland is the first country to have actually experimented. They did the first large-scale experiment with a UBI, which is a universal basic income, that basically says anybody deserves to have enough money to live. And we're going to try to figure out how to, and so, yeah, you roll your eyes, like, how does that work? Like, whatever. That seems crazy. That seems crazy, right? The problem is we may have to figure out these things eventually because we may get to that point where we have less labor. Now, that may not happen. There are big labor doomsayers that say, oh, robots are going to wipe out everything in 200 years. Others say that's silly. We're going to come alongside and we'll continue to do things. But it may mean more specialized knowledge. It may mean different things. So we have to imagine, what is it to be people of God in this world? And then we already talked about the extended lifespans as well. The fact that that is going to put a challenge on us. Yes, sir. What did you want to say? Right, yeah, and so that'll continue to happen. So we have to continue to think about who are we in that space. And then also in virtual reality. 1.49 billion people are on Facebook. There are entire virtual communities now, like Second Life, where people live most of their life in a virtual world. Could virtual reality be a thing that allows people to continue to live and connect across the globe, regardless of what age they are, regardless of who they are? But all of these things make us think, what are our true vocations? What are Christians called to? What is the essence? How do we do the Christian thing in this world? How do we follow the greatest commandments of loving God and neighbor within that world? And like I said, the idea of vocation, Luther did a great thing where he said, you don't have to go off and become a holy person to have a vocation. That's what people used to think. He said, you can be holy in the job that you do. You can be holy in the work that you do. Unfortunately, part of what we've done with that is we've turned it into you are your work. Where can we find the holy in the variety of things that humans uniquely do in the world? Yeah, and maybe we'll actually find this age to be an age of discovery of those things. And then the last thing that I've pretty much run out of time for, but I did want to mention, is the global community. I think the fact that now we are connected across the globe in ways that we never have been before is the fifth major challenge for anyone that claims any particular religion, any particular strain of faith. Because our faiths are butting up against each other. Our ideas about the world are butting up against each other in ways they never have before. We can travel and live around each other in ways that we never have before. And our economics moves faster than it ever has before. Do you know that over $5 trillion worth of currency is now traded every day in the stock markets? And that's because our technology allows us to have high-frequency trading, where large companies can trade millions of shares in a split second. Technological glitches lately have also scared the markets. terribly because they confuse things when there's a glitch, something happens. But we are so interconnected. And now in 2017, 7.4 billion internet users. 7.4 billion internet users. 48% users worldwide, which is up from just 16% in 2005. So when you think about all of the things that we're grappling with politically, socially, and religiously in our country right now, you're like, wow, well that makes sense. Our world really has changed a lot in a really brief amount of time. And then this global connection brings to light new global consciousness. We've already talked about the environment some and about how what we do in one place affects everybody. But there are all sorts of different global risks that we're more aware of than we ever have been before. And that will continue to be the case the longer we live into this world. And so I think that the idea of Paul talking about the fact that we are to live into a new creation, that the world will be made new, that we will be made new, what does that mean? And how does that interplay with the world that we live in today, this new global, boundary-breaking, technologically filled world? And those are things we want to continue to wrestle with as Christians, as people of faith, and with our neighbors that may not be of the same faith or the same background or anything else, because we do live now in a new creation. And I think that this idea of new creation could really take on new theological heft in our age if we played with it. So thank you for being here. If you'd like to talk about any of these things with me, I'm happy to chat anytime in my office. I love talking about stuff like this. So thanks for coming to the series this summer. It's been great. And I guess we get back on our normal schedule next week, pretty much. So good news. Next week's the mission thing, right? So it's still kind of a little different, but yep. But that happens every year, so and that'll be here. Yep.